Welcome to the AFR Saints channel, where we provide you daily content on your favorite team, the New Orleans Saints. Do us a favor and hit that subscribe button. Be sure to leave your comments below and smash that like button. Hudak. Let's just start with Jameis. I mean, that's the most obvious, and I think that's what everyone's want to talk about. So I'm curious, when you go back and you do your scouting and your film eval, the question has kind of been, all right, well, what is the issue? Is he not making reads? Is he just inaccurate throwing the football? Is it clear that his back injury is affecting him? What do you see?
I think the answer is somewhere in the middle of all of those things being factors at this point. What kind of just sticks out, it just feels like there is no leadership on offense right now. I think that it's kind of impossible to ignore the limitations of two injuries now. We haven't really gotten much insight on what the ankle injury was, but when you have fractured vertebrae in your back and you then have an ankle injury and that back injury likely affects your lower body, then I just feel like everything breaks down. And my issue has kind of been that it doesn't seem like Winston really recognizes that he perhaps has these limitations and is kind of just trying to do what he usually does while he's healthy. He's now thrown 5 turnovers in 2 games, and that's kind of hard to ignore given that, I think 7 or 8 games with 3 interceptions last year. He hasn't been fumbling like the other players have, and there's a lot of self-inflicted things like penalties, but he's certainly not the reason that they're going to win games at this point. And the play calling just seems a little off, and everything just seems disjointed and a little nonsensical with pressure in their face.
I'm glad you brought up pressure in your face, because that's clearly been another issue, is the number of sacks. And this is sort of another sort of point of contention. Is it that the offensive line isn't blocking well, or is it Jameis not recognizing or calling out protections?
Again, I think the answer is kind of both. You can see the run blocking really kind of show that the offensive line just isn't kind of up to its typical standard. I was kind of going back and looking at a few plays by Breeze, because it's kind of my point in this one where, not only did he set protection calls, but he'd make checks, read the defense, and alter receiver routes based on what he was reading out there. But he also had a really long time in the pocket. And I think what we're seeing here is, yes, Eric McCoy is responsible for setting those initial protections, but then it's kind of on the quarterback to see things like the nickel blisters. And not just that, but again, it kind of exploits the weaknesses of the defense, and it doesn't even feel like he's really reading it that much at all. But I would be remiss not to mention that things have gone under the radar. This is only Winston and McCoy's 4th full game together, because McCoy went down after 5 snaps in week 1 of last year, and his first game back was the Seattle game, and then the game following that, Winston went down for the season. So, my problem then, I guess, is why hasn't that been more of a point of emphasis this offseason? Because any way you look at it, kind of seems like all hands in the pot are kind of involved, and it's just a level of sloppiness that I don't think, arguments about playing in one preseason series would really solve at this point.
No, that's a good point. She's on Twitter at Maddy Hudak _94. Make sure you give her a follow. When you look at the offensive line then, as sort of a continuation there, who is playing well and who isn't right now?
I think James Hurst has really held up well, considering, the role he had to fill in the shoes of Terron Armstead. Andres Pete had a bad game in the run game, and he typically tends to be better as a run blocker, but his replacement in Calvin Throckmorton was even worse. Cesar Ruiz has his moments, but there's others where he just continues to look, entirely lost about what's going on. And for that reason, it's hard for me to kind of evaluate Ryan Branchick on its face, because the idea of being continuously worried about the guard next to you, and then, again, having those things like Winston not calling out, there's a blitz coming from this side, or perhaps, moving with the flow of pass rush and stepping, up through the top pocket or navigating out of it. And that's where, again, I feel like you have to go back to his injury there, but it just seems like everything's kind of breaking down in a way that's surprising at this point, because on its face, that's the same offensive unit for the last several seasons now, and they just don't seem like they've been jointed.
You also mentioned play calling, and that's been another thing that people have talked about. Is there a notable difference between Pete Carmichael and Sean Payton? And look, Maddy, I was one of those who was like, look, I mean, we saw Pete Carmichael as the primary play caller 3 times before, and all 3 times Saints finished top 6 in the NFL in offense. So I didn't really anticipate a giant drop-off there. Are you noticing differences in the play calling, either sequence structure, how they did it compared to how Pete Carmichael is doing it now?
Well, I think everyone kind of keeps pointing out the lack of Alvin Kamara in the passing game. And yes, he's open on some plays, and I think there's a larger discussion to be had about, understanding kind of what a play design looks like, because just because a guy looks open doesn't mean that he's the primary read there. Mm-hmm. And a lot of these plays, they're set up, I think, more for the amount of receivers they now have rather than kind of the change at quarterback. And I think that's almost kind of where it's going wrong. I don't really know, I'm not an offensive-minded person as much as a defense, but they've gotten so many great wide receivers, and yet it just seems like the wrong play call kind of every single time. I think a lot of those throws a healthy Winston makes, and then I think we're having somewhat of a different conversation here. I also feel like just Drew Brees' ability to improvise really came out a lot of time, but not having Alvin Kamara be kind of that threat in the passing game as much, I think Sean Payton really designed plays to get Alvin Kamara involved and have him be a passing threat because, quite frankly, they don't have much of a run game threat right now at this point either. And so that makes the offense be a little one-dimensional. And when you're constantly playing from behind, I think I saw something where they scored 10 total points in the first half of every single game through 3 weeks now. So if you're always playing from behind, then it's hard also to evaluate, are these play calls something that we would otherwise see if they weren't constantly playing catch-up?
Maddy, and a couple more minutes with Maddy Hudak, are there ways where if we just sort of agree that the offense generally is broken right now, which, I mean, it's hard not, to your point, they've scored 51 points total this season. 38 have come in the fourth quarter. I mean, it's just they aren't scoring. It's very obvious, like what's happening here. So what is something that's fixable that you could say, okay, even if Jameis Winston's back is not healthy, this week against Minnesota, they could do this?
Be more aware of the fact that teams at this point kind of can see that they're not picking up blitzes, and I think you're going to see a lot of zero blitz plays moving forward. Minnesota hasn't had the production from their pass rush unit, I think, as much as they like to with the caliber of guys there, but going forward, you'd kind of like to see a little less of those deep shots, and it just doesn't seem like he has the ability to put touch on. They're so far off at this point. It just looks so weird, especially, again, with them not really, and I understand why, but not really elaborating on how much he's limited by injury. Kind of throws so far behind Jarvis Landry that he ends up getting hurt. I think the quick fix, again, is get more, feed the ball more to Alvin Kamara out in the flat and have extra tight ends in there blocking. At the same time, those tight ends have been in there and have kind of missed their assignments. I think discipline play will also make a big difference. They have gotten so many self-inflicted penalties at this point that have killed drives, and then you add in the turnover factor. I think if you played cleaner football in general across every almost unit on offense, then I think you can kind of shoulder this load and figure out what is the best plan moving forward.
Maddy, I also wanted to ask about Tyrann Mathieu because I've gotten this question often, so I'm curious what your film study has shown. The stats obviously aren't there. The impact hasn't really been there like many had thought. But sometimes you can still be impacting the game, although it doesn't show up in the stat sheet. What are you seeing from Tyrann so far?
Yeah, that's a good point, too. Safety is one of the worst positions on the broadcast. You almost never see them unless they're involved in the play, and it's usually because the catch is either made or not made deep down the field. But what stuck out to me, I don't think, Mathieu has necessarily not had an impact so far in the first couple games. I just think there's been so many kind of playmakers back there. Pete Werner is deservedly garnering a lot of attention for what he's been doing. And, there's been really good run stops by Justin Evans. So I just think they've kind of needed less of that work from Mathieu. What stuck out to me in this game, and I pulled up the coverage report too, they lost Marcus May that week with some type of injury. And, they ran middle of the field close coverage 77% of the time. And that has been an average about 40 to 50 the first 3 weeks. We've been seeing them run so much more cover 2, cover 4 even, and really taking advantage of the versatility of May and Mathieu. And so a lot of the time he was in single high coverage at safety, and Matthew at free safety to me isn't really getting the best production out of what his traits offer. And to that same note, I don't think TJ Williams back there in single high is really the best use of him either. But they don't seem to have kind of that chemistry to play a two-back set like we saw with May and Matthew. So I think, honestly, that May's absence really just shows in the employment of coverage.
It's great stuff. She's on Twitter at Maddy Hudak _94. Good enough to be a contributor to us here. Of course, Saints Wire as well. You can go check that out. Maddy, we always appreciate it. We'll be in touch, and here's hoping the next time we talk, we're talking about some more optimistic things regarding this team, because so far through 3 games, it's been a rough watch, no doubt. We appreciate it, Maddy. Thanks.
Thanks.
Hey, thanks so much for watching. Please leave your comments. I love to interact, and be sure to hit the red subscribe button below.